The Mongol Empire, an unstoppable force that once stretched from the frozen plains of Siberia to the sands of Persia, had struck terror into the hearts of all who heard its name. Kingdoms burned, cities vanished, and armies shattered wherever the thunder of hooves echoed across the land. Their reputation was carved in fire and fear. They were the storm from the east, disciplined, fast, and merciless. For over a century, no one had been able to resist them. But in the heart of Europe, a new story was beginning, one of resistance, courage, and the slow unraveling of the myth of Mongol invincibility. It began in the 13th century, when Europe stood divided, dozens of kingdoms, each with its own language, ruler, and rivalries. While they fought each other, the Mongols had already conquered China, Persia, and Russia. When their horsemen crossed the Carpathian Mountains into Eastern Europe, they seemed like demons out of the mist. They moved with impossible speed, no supply lines, no hesitation. Their scouts appeared miles ahead of the main force, spreading fear before the real army even arrived. Entire villages were erased overnight. The Hungarian and Polish kings sent armies to stop them, but they were cut down with precision and speed that Europe had never seen before. At the Battle of Legnica in 1241, a coalition of European knights faced the Mongols in open combat. The knights, proud and armored in steel, believed their courage and faith would protect them. But the Mongols fought with deception and mobility. They pretended to flee, drawing the knights into a trap. When the Europeans gave chase, they were surrounded by hidden archers. Arrows rained down from every direction, the air filled with the hiss of death. By the time the knights realized what had happened, it was too late. Thousands lay dead, their armor pierced by the curved tips of Mongol arrows. In the same year, Hungary faced the full force of Batu Khan's army, and the result was the same. Cities like Pest and Esztergom were burned to the ground, their streets filled with ash and silence. The Mongols had proven themselves invincible once again. Yet Europe, for all its chaos, did not surrender. The survivors began to learn. They studied the Mongol way of war, the speed, the discipline, the coordination between cavalry and archers. They saw how the Mongols used fear as a weapon just as deadly as their bows, and slowly Europe began to change. Kings and generals realized that the age of pride and unpreparedness was over. They started building better fortifications, stronger walls, and tighter alliances. Armies began to train in new ways, faster, more coordinated, less dependent on individual heroics and more on collective strategy. In monasteries and castles, stories spread of the Mongol tactics, the feigned retreats, the night ambushes, the endless streams of horse archers. The Europeans realized that brute strength could not win this war. To defeat a storm, they would have to become one. And so across the continent, kingdoms began to cooperate as they never had before. Intelligence networks were built, watchtowers rose along borders, and scouts patrolled the mountain passes where the Mongols might return. The church even urged unity under faith, framing resistance to the Mongols as a sacred duty. Meanwhile, the Mongols continued to push westward. Their ambition was endless. They sought to conquer not just lands but minds, to make the very thought of resistance seem foolish. But Europe was changing faster than they realized. By the mid-13th century, the Mongol horde faced something new: prepared defenses, improved crossbows that could pierce even the finest Mongol armor, and fortresses that refused to fall. The old tactics that once terrified the world no longer worked as easily. The terrain of Europe, dense forests, rivers, and walled cities, made their cavalry less effective. And for the first time, they met enemies who understood them. In Hungary, King Bela IV rebuilt his kingdom after the Mongol invasion, fortifying every town with stone walls. He reorganized his army and trained them to fight on horseback like their enemies. Across Europe, engineers improved siege weapons and knights adapted their tactics. The Mongols, who once seemed untouchable, began to face resistance that slowed them down. Every new campaign took longer, costlier, and less decisive. The aura of invincibility began to crack. Then something unexpected happened. In 1242, as suddenly as they had come, the Mongols withdrew from Europe. Their great leader, Ogedei Khan, had died in the east, and Batu Khan, commanding the invasion, had to return home for the succession. But the damage was done, and so were the lessons learned. The Europeans had survived the storm, and in their survival they had found strength. They now knew what it meant to face the greatest army in the world and not be destroyed. For decades after, Europe lived with the fear of the Mongols' return. But when they finally came again, they were not the same. The empire had begun to fracture from within. Succession disputes, cultural divisions, and the vastness of their territory stretched them thin. The Europeans they once thought weak had become stronger, united by necessity. The fortresses that once fell easily now stood tall. Crossbows and cannons began to change the balance of power. The Mongols' speed and mobility were no longer unbeatable when faced with walls, steel bolts, and disciplined formations. The age of Mongol terror began to fade, replaced by an age of learning and adaptation. Europe had looked into the face of destruction and found a way to endure. The Invincible Empire had met its first true obstacle, not in another conqueror, but in the collective resilience of nations that refused to vanish, and so, in the shadow of their own victories, the Mongols planted the seeds of their decline. What began as another conquest became a lesson for the world. For the first time in centuries, the unstoppable horsemen from the east were stopped, not by force alone, but by knowledge, unity, and time. Europe had been scarred, yes, but it had also been reborn. The sun was sinking behind the rolling fields of Waterloo, its light dimming through a haze of smoke and drizzle. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once commanded the fate of empires, stood staring across a battlefield that was slipping out of his grasp. Around him, the thunder of guns had grown weaker, the cries of men fainter, replaced by a deeper, heavier silence. The silence that comes when the tide of war turns, and no amount of courage can stop it. For hours he had fought to bend destiny once again to his will, but now as the rain-soaked air thickened and the ground trembled under distant cannon fire, he began to sense the truth. His empire was dying before his eyes. In the chaos of the afternoon, as French formations shattered and reformed again and again, Napoleon's mind worked like a machine, calculating, adjusting, hoping. He had fought Wellington's army to a standstill. If the Prussians could just be delayed, if he could hold for a few more hours, victory might still be his. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. The British lines were battered. La Haye-Sainte had fallen. The Imperial Guard waited in reserve, a wall of veterans whose loyalty was as unshakable as steel. But fate had other plans. To the east, through the mist and smoke, the faint glimmer of bayonets appeared on the horizon. At first, some of Napoleon's men thought they were reinforcements, perhaps Grouchy's corps arriving at last. But soon came the shouts, the realization that chilled the blood of every French soldier. The Prussians were here. Blücher's army, driven by vengeance from the beating they had taken days earlier at Ligny, was marching straight toward the battlefield. And this time, nothing could stop them. Wellington, exhausted but alert, saw the moment unfold like a master gambler watching the final card turn in his favor. For most of the day, he had fought defensively, allowing the terrain and his discipline to absorb the furious assaults of Napoleon's army. His men had clung to every farmhouse, every ridge, every muddy patch of earth. Now, with Blücher's dark masses emerging from the eastern woods, Wellington gave a simple order: hold the line. Help was on the way. Napoleon turned to his staff, his eyes sharp beneath his hat. "We must crush Wellington before Blücher arrives," he said. His voice, though calm, carried the strain of desperation. Messengers rode out. Orders were shouted through the rain. Marshal Ney, still covered in mud and gunpowder from his earlier charges, was told to press forward once more. The ground was soaked, the horses were exhausted, and yet again the French cavalry thundered toward the British ridge. It was a magnificent sight. Thousands of cuirassiers gleaming in the dim light, their armor streaked with rain, their cries echoing across the field. But it was also madness. Wellington's troops, veterans of countless battles across Spain and Portugal, had formed into tight squares. 4 walls of men, bristling with bayonets, disciplined and steady. The French cavalry smashed into them again and again, and each time they were thrown back, cut down by volleys of musket fire that tore through the smoke. Ney, fearless and unyielding, led charge after charge until his sword broke and his face was blackened with soot. Yet for all his bravery, the ground would not yield. As the last charge faltered, Napoleon's artillery opened up in fury, pounding the ridge in an effort to shatter the British defense. But the cannons, caked in mud, could not fire quickly enough. The ammunition wagons lagged behind, bogged down in the soaked fields. The Emperor watched, grim and motionless, as every advantage he had ever relied upon slipped away. The clock ticked. The sun sank lower, and the sound of Prussian drums grew louder. When Blücher's first columns appeared on Napoleon's right flank, it was like the arrival of a storm. The French, already stretched thin, turned to meet them, but they were too few. Napoleon sent whatever reserves he had left, units that had been meant to secure his final victory, just to hold the line. The battlefield became a whirlpool of confusion. Commands were lost in the noise. Formations broke apart. The smoke grew so thick that men fired blindly at shapes they could barely see. Wellington seized the moment. "Now, Maitland," he shouted, turning to one of his generals. Hidden behind the ridge, the British guardsmen waited, crouched and ready. When the French Imperial Guard began their climb up the hill, the proudest, most feared soldiers in Europe, Wellington's voice rang out, "Up, guards, and at them." What followed was one of the most dramatic moments in military history. The Imperial Guard, veterans of 100 battles, marched through cannon fire, their faces set with determination. They had never known defeat. Napoleon himself rode behind them, watching the advance that he hoped would snatch victory from disaster. The ground shook under their steady pace. "Vive l'Empereur," they cried. The British, silent until the last moment, waited until the Guard was almost upon them. Then came a thunderous volley. Whole ranks of the Guard fell. The survivors pressed on, but another volley followed and another. Smoke enveloped the hilltop. For the first time in their history, the Imperial Guard hesitated. Then, as if the very spirit of France cracked, they began to fall back. A ripple of disbelief swept through the French army. "La garde recule," someone shouted. "The Guard is retreating." The word spread like fire. Discipline collapsed. Men who had fought all day now broke and ran. What had been a battle became a rout. Napoleon rode forward, shouting for his men to stand. "They lie! The Guard does not retreat." But it was useless. The tide had turned completely. The Prussians smashed into the French right flank, and Wellington's army surged forward from the ridge. Drums beat, muskets flashed. The air filled with the roar of pursuit. The Grande Armée, once the most formidable force in the world, disintegrated into chaos. In the fading light, Napoleon's world came apart. The field that had once seemed a chessboard under his control was now a nightmare of mud, corpses, and fire. Wagons overturned in ditches, horses screamed. Soldiers threw away their weapons and fled south toward the road to Charleroi. The Emperor's carriage waited in the distance, but he lingered as though unable to accept what his eyes saw. His hat was gone. His face was streaked with rain and dirt. For a long moment he sat on his horse, silent, staring at the ruin of everything he had built. He had gambled everything on this day, his throne, his empire, his legend, and lost. The man who had once crowned himself Emperor of the French, who had marched through Europe undefeated, was now a fugitive. He had been undone not only by the strength of his enemies, but by time, by fatigue, by the simplest forces of nature. The Prussians gave no mercy. They pursued the fleeing French through the night. Wellington, his own army too battered to chase, stood upon the ridge and looked across the field of the dead. "By God," he murmured, "I don't think they know when they're beaten." But they were beaten utterly and finally. Napoleon reached the village of La Belle Alliance as darkness fell. Around him rode the remnants of his staff, their uniforms torn and mud-streaked. He spoke little. Those who were there later said that he seemed calm, too calm, as if his mind had already left the battlefield behind. He gave brief orders to regroup at Charleroi, but everyone knew the truth. The war was over. The Empire was over. Back in Paris, days later, he would try to muster defiance once more. He would speak of raising new armies, of defending France itself. But no one believed in him anymore. His marshals were weary. His people were exhausted. The legend that had carried him across Europe had evaporated in the rain at Waterloo. Within weeks he abdicated again, this time for good. Soon after, he surrendered to the British, hoping for mercy. Instead, he was sent into exile, far from France, on the lonely island of St. Helena, half a world away from the fields that had once trembled beneath his boots.